This war is about to get really delightfully lively. In the last month, the Russians have started fielding, this is what's called a Fab 1500. It's a 1,500 kilogram weapon. It's a dumb bomb that eventually makes a blast radius that is more than a third of a mile across. The problem that the Russians have always had is accuracy. The problem that we already have is heavy blast capacity. We fight a continent, a hemisphere away from where we're from. So we have to be precise with our weapon systems. So we have better guidance and better intel. The Russians are fighting among a much shorter chain of support. So they go for the big bada boom. What they've done with the Fab 1500, a bomb that has 2 tons of explosive capacity, is in the last few weeks they've started fitting them with something called a glide kit. If you guys remember back to Desert Storm, we started putting glide kits on our dumb bombs. They were only 500 pounders, tiny compared to these guys. But that's what allowed us to target bridges and buildings in Iraq with precision. The Russians don't have, within an order of magnitude, that kind of accuracy. These things only hit in 50 to 100 feet. But when your blast radius is 2,000 feet across, that's plenty. We're seeing the Russians marry their sheer mailed fist approach to military ordnance to a degree of precision. And in the battle for Avdiivka, they dropped about 300 of these things in a 48-hour period. That's what won them that battle. And we're seeing a fundamentally different Russian military emerge in just the last few weeks. Massive power, reasonable accuracy. We've never had to face that before. Now, for their part, the Ukrainians are also innovating with drones. The one at the bottom, this is the Beaver, not a very intimidating name. And the one above it is the Scythe, which is literally made out of plywood. This one has an operational range of about 600 kilometers. This one 400. This one carries about a 15-pound bomb. This one carries about a 70-pound bomb. This one is literally built in people's garages and then targeted by the Ukrainian military. And they're using these things to target refineries. They have found in the last 2 months the capacity to gut punch the Russian economy in a way that none of the sanctions have done so far. The Russian educational system collapsed in 1986. The youngest people in Russia who are worthy of the term engineer turned 64 this year. The ability to repair a fractionating column in a refinery is a limited skill set that the Russians no longer have. And the few people they know who are adjacent to that skill set are in Ukraine as part of the war effort or are building munitions. And so we're seeing more and more refineries come offline. But the best part is this guy up here. This is a Phoenix Ghost. This is an American-made operation. It's man-portable. It's modular. You put in a backpack with a 10-pound bomb. You hike into Russia as part of a special forces group. You go 1,000 miles from the border. You identify a target. You hand launch it. And some of the more recent attacks we've seen in the last week are definitely Phoenix Ghosts. And so we've seen lots of refineries go offline. All the oranges are where we've had a meaningful attack with operations going down. Not permanent. These things can be repaired, but not quickly and not by the Russians. So they're having to bring in third-party nationals. My guess is that most of those third-party nationals are Chinese, which means we're this far away from the Ukrainians specifically targeting Chinese workers to bust sanctions with American-made weapons. This war is about to get really delightfully lively. Okay. So that's really bad from an energy processing point of view. There's also problems on the production side. This is Western Siberia, in case anyone is looking for a sunrise. You go far enough north and get into cold enough territory, you get into a zone where the ground never really thaws in the winter. And in the summer, the top layer will thaw, and you'll get something like this, thermal karst lakes. If you want to produce something in this zone, what you got to do is wait for it to freeze solid, which in Russia means like 9 months of the year. Then you run a berm out through hundreds, if not thousands of miles of empty territory. You run a piece of infrastructure down the middle of it, a pipe, a road, a rail line, and then while everything's frozen, you drill on a drilling platform. Because you can't drill when it's melted. You can't drill through swamp. And then you produce. So these are the highest upfront costs for material development on the planet. Unfortunately for the Russians, it's a dynamic landscape. So if a fault opens up and everything drains, it drains to the side and you get a massive slip. Or maybe it drains down, in which case you get a sinkhole. Or maybe you have a very, very warm summer and some of the permafrost melts deeper. And then when it refreezes, when water freezes, it expands and you get a bubble in the land. These are all really bad for infrastructure. And remember, the Russian educational system collapsed a long time ago. The Russians have the highest maintenance costs in the world, and most of this work for the last 30 years hasn't been done by them. It's been done by Exxon and BP, and especially the Dutch and the Germans. And all that work stopped when the Ukraine war began. Could be sanctions, could be war damage, could be lack of maintenance. We need to prepare for a world where all of the materials coming out of Russia don't make it.
It will continue until the day that the Russians lose the ability to fight. The soonest, let me rephrase that. From a manpower point of view, that's 2032. That's the point where they simply run out of men in their 20s to theoretically even throw into the fight. So that's the outside. It could happen sooner based on what happens to logistical systems. I don't think it's a sanctions issue. It's a question of whether or not the Russians are physically capable of bringing material and men to the front. So if the Ukrainians manage to take out, say, the Kerch Strait Bridge, then they can't resupply the Crimea at all, and all of a sudden half of the occupied territory turns into a giant shield of exposure for the Russians. That could really change the math. Another possibility, what the Ukrainians are doing right now with using long and short-range drones to target Russian refineries, is having a very real impact on the ability of the Russians to process crude. And the Russian pipeline system is not like the American system. If the crude can't get out, if it sits in the pipes, Russia's winters are no joke, and they last until June. If they freeze, then the pipes stop working all the way back to the wellheads in Siberia. And if the wells freeze because there's nothing moving, you have to re-drill those wells. So when you had that sort of backup in 1989 to 1992, it took the Russians 30 years to get back to their Cold War levels of oil production. That would destroy their income stream. Oil is the single largest line item for them for income. And without that income, the Chinese and North Koreans, for example, Iran, aren't going to be supplying them with equipment. That's a different sort of war.